When you think of Mexico, what comes to mind? It's a G20 economy, right? A major manufacturing hub, a country just bursting with resources and talent. And yet, it's still grappling with this persistent development gap. So, what's really going on here? Let's dive into this puzzle.
It's a question that really goes beyond the typical headlines about cartels or tourism. The answer isn't simple, and it's not about any one thing. It's found deep inside the country's institutional and economic structures. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack the core issues that are really holding Mexico back.
All right, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll define what this development gap actually looks like. Then, we'll get into these systemic problems of corruption and governance. We'll also look at where money is coming from versus how wealth is created at home. And we'll analyze the big gap between the political narrative and what's actually happening on the ground. And finally, we'll map out what the path forward could look like. Okay, so first things first. To really get a handle on the challenge, we need to see what this paradox actually looks like. And believe me, it's a story of some pretty deep contrasts. Now take a look at this. This is where it gets really stark. The sheer scale of inequality between regions is just massive. I mean, look at those numbers. In the southern state of Chiapas, 2/3 of the population lives in poverty. Compare that to Baja California in the north, where it's less than 10%. That's more than a six-fold difference. It's almost like you're looking at two completely different countries inside of one border. And then when we zoom out to the international picture, we see another big gap. Mexico's GDP per capita, which is basically a measure of economic output per person, is consistently way behind the average for the OECD, the club of major developed economies. So this isn't just a story about poverty. It's about the entire economy punching below its weight. So why the gap? Well, a huge piece of this puzzle is corruption. But we really need to stop thinking about it as just a series of scandals with a few bad apples. It's much deeper than that. We need to see it as a systemic failure of institutions. And this definition is really key. Corruption isn't just about greed. It thrives where the rule of law is weak or where it's applied inconsistently. It's a structural problem, where the system itself is set up in a way that allows public money and power to be siphoned off for private benefit. And this system, it operates on every single level. It starts with what you might call petty corruption, the bribe to a traffic cop to get out of a ticket. Then you have administrative corruption, which is maybe paying a bribe to speed up a business permit or secure a government contract. But at the very highest level, you have something called state capture, and this is where it gets really serious. This is when powerful private interests aren't just bribing officials anymore. They're actually shaping the laws themselves. They are literally rewriting the rules of the game to make sure they always come out on top. And the economic fallout from this is absolutely massive. The government collects far less in taxes than it should, only about 10% of GDP, because so many people and businesses operate in the informal, off-the-books economy. This starves the state of the money it needs for schools, for roads, for hospitals. And it creates this vicious cycle, where for many people, the most logical choice for survival is to operate outside the formal system. Now, all of this weakness, well, it creates a vacuum. And where the official state is weak or just plain absent, you can be sure that other powers are going to move in to fill that space. This is especially true when it comes to organized crime. This quote just perfectly captures the dynamic. You see, criminal groups in Mexico aren't just a law enforcement issue. They are a governance problem. They step into places where the state either can't or won't provide basic security and order. They start taxing businesses, they resolve disputes, they essentially become a parallel and often predatory form of government. And one of the key reasons this governance gap exists is something called fiscal centralization. The simplest way to think about it is this. Imagine the national government in Mexico City holds one giant wallet for the entire country. The state and local governments have very, very little power to raise their own money through things like local property taxes. They are almost totally dependent on whatever the central government decides to send them. And the result? Your local authorities, the ones who are closest to the people and their problems, are chronically broke and powerless to fix local roads or deal with local crime. So when you have local governments that are underfunded and formal job opportunities are hard to come by, it creates this immense pressure on people to find support somewhere else. And for millions and millions of Mexican families, that support comes from outside the country. Just look at this chart. The amount of money being sent home by Mexicans working abroad, mostly in the United States, it's just staggering, and it's been climbing like crazy. In fact, these remittances are now the single largest source of external financing for the entire country. It's a vital lifeline that literally keeps millions of families out of extreme poverty.
But this creates a really fundamental distinction that we have to understand. Remittances are an external lifeline. They are absolutely essential for alleviating poverty in the here and now. But they don't build sustainable, long-term wealth for the country. That can only come from an internal engine, growth and productivity. And that depends entirely on fixing all of these domestic, institutional problems that we've been talking about.
And this brings us to what might be the core argument of our entire explainer. This growing, and I think dangerous, gap between the political story that's being told and the complicated, messy reality of actually building strong institutions. Think about it like this. In most well-functioning countries, a government achieves something. Maybe they lower crime rates or improve schools, and that result shapes their public story, their narrative. But in Mexico, there's a real risk of the opposite happening, where an incredibly powerful narrative is created to manufacture the perception of results, even when the underlying weaknesses haven't changed at all. And the most famous example of this is the daily presidential press conference, the Mañanera. We are talking hours every single morning. This is something that is virtually unheard of in any other major democracy. Now, if you're a supporter, you see this as a radical act of transparency and accountability. But if you're a critic, you see it as a powerful tool for completely dominating the news cycle and controlling the national conversation. But from a structural point of view, it raises a much deeper, more important question. When governing seems to require hours and hours of daily explanation, is the government actually busy solving underlying problems? Or is it busy managing the perception of those problems?
And you know what? This distinction is everything. Because at the end of the day, long-term development is not driven by a consistent narrative. It's driven by institutional consistency. Things like predictable laws, fair courts, and smart, sustained investment. Communication can fill the space for a while, but it can never, ever be a substitute for real, tangible results.
So what's the path forward? Well, it means finally confronting these deep, structural hurdles that have been holding the country back for generations. And here are the big ones. A massive informal economy with over half the workforce getting no benefits. A state that, because of that, can't collect enough taxes to fund itself properly. An education system where spending just doesn't translate into quality results. A judicial system that's too inefficient and corrupt to guarantee the rule of law. And this is a huge one. A critical lack of investment in research and development, which is really the engine of all future growth.
And this table really shows what's possible when a country gets its focus right. I mean, look at South Korea. It transformed itself through massive investment in education and R&D. Or look at Poland, which after the fall of communism focused relentlessly on fighting corruption and reforming its institutions. Even Vietnam, which is focused on building a powerful domestic industry for exports. Every path is different, of course, but the common thread is always a focus on strengthening internal capacity and productivity.
And so that leaves us with the ultimate question. Mexico has the people, it has the resources, it has an incredible geographic advantage right next to the world's biggest market. The challenge has never been a lack of potential, it's been a lack of institutional capacity. The real test for the next generation will be to finally build that consistency, to close that painful gap between the Mexico that is and the Mexico that could be.